Good morning, folks, and a special welcome to our visitors from outside on the Maritimes. It's a pleasure to be here. And some of you may be wondering, why is this guy in a chair? And I'll tell you, I was like most of you about 7 years ago, running around, playing tennis and swimming and biking and all that. And I was living overseas at the time, and something happened very suddenly to me that, in fact, ends up being hereditary in my family. And I rushed back to Halifax, went to emergency, and the last thing I remember was the chaplain standing over me, giving me my last rites. Luckily, I woke up, and I think I'm still here. And at that stage, I made a commitment. When I saw all the barriers in my way to make this my life, is to basically become a barrier buster for persons with disabilities. And as well, at the same time, the province made a major commitment for an Accessibility Act. We're now the third province in Canada to have such an act. In fact, the Canadian government has followed us as well, and we also have a national act on accessibility. And the reason for that is because of the numbers. In Nova Scotia, about a third of our population has at least one form of a disability. We're the highest in Canada because we're also the oldest population in Canada. So that has significant impact. And when you have a disability like myself, I don't walk or roll alone. It impacts my family members when I go to a restaurant, my friends and others. If you just include direct family members, we're talking 560,000 Nova Scotians. So over half of our population is directly affected by persons with disabilities. But for some reason, that large minority, in fact, we are the largest minority in the province, it has not resonated with the policymakers and planners and urban designers up until just recently. And really, that's what our movement is all about, is to ensure that we design cities for all people. Another important thing is perhaps I'm a bad example to be leading this for the province. Not all disabilities are visible. Many are invisible. People who have issues with their sight, with their hearing, of course, cognitive issues. So in fact, those are most predominant within our community. So that's an important consideration to have. And as well with seniors, currently in the province, those over 65, 43% of those have at least one form of a disability. So that's a very large portion of the population. Now, we have this new Accessibility Act. We're the third province in Canada. And what the province has done, and it's quite bold, is that they've set a target for us to become accessible by 2030. Seems like a long way off, but it's not. We've had generations of neglect for persons with disabilities. The other important thing is that in the past, doing things for persons with disability has been sort of doing as a social service to be nice to those poor people in wheelchairs. Well, we've said to the province, listen, read your human rights legislation, not just provincially, but nationally and internationally as well with the UN, is that we have a right to have access to government services and other things. The other important thing is how we put the whole legislation together, a lot of community engagement, and that's continuing in that we now have a group of citizens that's advising the province on making things happen. 2030 is a nice thing to say, but what does it really mean? So the province, in its act, mandated itself to prepare an implementation strategy, which it has done. We call it Access by Design, which is really, really important. You design it in on the front end. The cost is minimal. It's the retrofits, not just for the built environment, but on policies, procedures, all those sorts of things. And as well, the government has prepared a plan. Municipal governments will play a key role, and I'll talk about that. And as Benji mentioned, and I thank you, Benji, this whole thing of we need to change systems, and standards are key to that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The Accessibility Act here, it's all about removing barriers. And it's not just physical barriers. Perhaps the biggest barrier we have is an attitudinal barrier, or just a lack of awareness of the barriers that persons with disabilities face. So we're doing a lot of work with the schools, including universities. In fact, when I went to planning school back in the early 70s, there was nothing in our curriculum about accessibility. We're talking a third of the population. That is starting to happen at Dalhousie and other universities. And it's not just planning, schools of architecture, it's also IT for assistive technologies and what have you. So that's really, really important. And, the curb cuts you see, what we call the curb cut effect. The curb cut doesn't just help me, it helps many others in the community. So rising tide lifts all boats, and that's what a term that Rick Hansen uses an awful lot. And as you see here is all the various users that are benefiting from the curb cuts. And it's not just curb cuts. Where do you think Siri came from? The early development of Siri was for the blind, to be able to read things in and then translate it into the written words. And another interesting sort of anecdote is, did you know that the American football huddle is a curb cut effect? So what's he talking about? Well, about 100 years ago in college football, there was a college that focused on blind and deaf individuals, mostly deaf playing. And when they called the play, they huddled because of sign language. If they didn't, someone could have read their play across the field. So it's sort of interesting how this curb cut effect affects everybody in this room and benefits everybody. On standards, of course, built environment, we've got a pretty good building code, but that just deals with the building itself. It doesn't deal with the exterior environment out there. So we're working on a whole new standard. Education, a lot of talk about diversity in education, but not a lot of action, working on that. Delivery of goods and services. For example, websites, accessible to the blind. Most are not. Moving towards that. Communications, public transit and transportation, and of course, employment as well. So, and on the whole thing of standards, one of the things that has been happening in the community is the Rick Hansen Foundation has started to work on basically an international standard on the built environment. They don't like to call it a standard, but I think it's going to evolve into that, and I'm going to hand it over to Sarah to talk about that.
Okay, so I'm going to do an introduction to what we call the Rick Hansen Foundation Accessibility Certification Program. We try to keep a little bit of a short term on that with RHFAC. And I'm going to start out by talking about accessibility nationally. We did a recent Angus Reid Institute study across the country in regards to how accessibility affects us. We ended up with some supporting results that says that 24% of Canadians have a mobility, vision, or hearing disability or challenge. This supports some of the StatsCan, although StatsCan comes in a little bit lower towards 20%. 47%, so you think half of the population of Canada, has a relationship with someone who has a physical disability or challenge. When we ask them about how much they actually care about access, we get some very interesting results. 2/3 are concerned about future mobility challenges, so a huge percentage. 53% want Canada-wide standards for universal access, and 70% say that new buildings should be universally accessible. And for confirmation with this room, new buildings are not universally accessible in many cities in Canada right now. Accessibility also matters in reference to money. We talked about malls a little bit this morning. 30% consider accessibility when deciding which business to visit. So 9 million adults are deciding whether or not they want to go to that restaurant, dependent on whether or not that restaurant is accessible. And then 21% would support a certified accessible business more often. So that's the program that I'm going to talk about this morning. Okay, so we created an accessibility certification program. It's a rating system that measures the accessibility of the built environment. It's based on the concept of LEED. So you think about LEED as being a consistent way to be able to rate buildings based on their greening initiatives. This is what we've done for accessibility. We've used a consistent methodology by using a national and international scale. So we've partnered with the Canadian Standards Association to use their standard in order to be able to conduct those ratings. So what can be rated? So we created the program to be able to rate the built environment, but what does the built environment actually mean? It addresses commercial, institutional, and public buildings. It also addresses multi-unit residential buildings. So we don't do single-family homes. Accessibility means something different to every person, and so being able to rate a single-family home is not as much relevant. We also rate trails and pathways. It's an interesting example when we talk about the Cogswell district here in Halifax. We're doing a lot of work on the trails and pathways at Cogswell because of the fact that that site has agreed to build to be gold. We also need to be able to determine whether or not you can get in between each of those buildings. And we can also look at final design plans. So you can get a pre-construction approval to be accessible so that that way you're actually building to accessibility as opposed to retrofitting to accessibility. So, how are sites, buildings, or facilities rated? These are each of the sections of the rating system. So it covers, and anybody who is interested in having the big long textbook on this, by the way, is more than welcome. You can send me a note. So there's 400 pages on how this happens, but it's everything from vehicular access, exterior approach, interior circulation, etc. One of the important ones, of course, sanitary facilities is a huge issue for people with disabilities in built environment, and as I mentioned, trails and pathways. So how do you actually get into buildings, between buildings, and how do you use cities? Major benefits associated with the certification program are really about defining something that we can use nationally. Right now, there's lots of work being done on harmonization of standards across the country, but that hasn't been done quite yet to date. And we really need to be able to define access and what that means using that common methodology. It also provides an inventory of existing access issues. So, if you have a rating conducted, you get a result that provides you with a specific understanding of each of those sections of accessibility. You can use that for planning purposes. You can use that to be able to promote how well you did. You can use it to talk to your committees. Most municipalities have accessibility committees, etc. It also creates opportunities for businesses to take advantage of a majorly underutilized workforce. So people with disabilities in Canada are extremely underemployed. It's a highly educated population, and it's an issue across the country. Lastly, it creates a pool of trained professionals that are proven proficient in developing access. So right now, as a result of lots of great engagement, we have lots of different types of groups that are making decisions about accessibility. And we really wanted to make sure that there was people who are appropriately trained to be able to conduct those ratings. Okay, so I've got a little video, hopefully. This is our Vice President of Access and Inclusion, Brad McCannell, and he's just going to talk about accessibility.
It's kind of interesting, really. Everybody agrees that we want more accessibility in the built environment, but nobody can agree on what that means. One of the things that's happening right now is facility operators will take a checklist out, and they'll go to their facility and walk into the washroom, and they look and say, well, it's got grab bars, check. It's got a power door, check. It's got lowered urinals, check. Then they'll go off and check out the elevator. And they'll say, look, it's got proper handrails, it's got raised buttons, it's got braille and tactile, it's got a light-covered floor. It's a good elevator. And they walk away thinking, this must be a pretty accessible building. But nobody checked the front door, nobody checked the reception desk. Nobody looked at the workspace to see if it was accessible for people with disabilities as employees. At the foundation, we recognize this is a giant gap. We understand that access has to be judged on the entire user experience, their whole experience throughout the building. You can have a terrifically accessible washroom, but it doesn't mean anything if it's on top of a set of stairs. At its simplest, the Rick Hansen system is a national scale where we can place the overall accessibility of a building and be recognized that that's what access actually means. The real strength of the program is it creates a consistent methodology to measure access across a broad range of environments, from commercial space to multifamily residential dwellings, park space, trails, picnic areas. All the places where we live, work, play, and learn as people with disabilities and as important members of the community. By completing this course and becoming recognized access professionals to the industry, you'll be in a unique position to literally change the built environment, to create a new level of awareness, to change attitudes. And with that attitudinal change, create an opportunity to create a barrier-free world for everyone.
So on that note, there really are quite a few accessible washrooms.
Let's take a minute and talk about access.
We can stop him now. He's back. There really are quite a few accessible washrooms that we find that are inaccessible to actually get to. It happens all the time. There's lots of legislation that says that you have to have an accessible washroom. It doesn't actually say where it has to be. So but it does happen. It's pretty crazy. Relationship with CSA Group, just as background, we partnered with the Canadian Standards Association, as I said, in order to ensure that the rating system was completely professionalized. They conduct our exam for anybody who's trained in the program. They also review ratings and give final approvals on the registry. They host our RHFAC registry, and only sites that have been approved to list publicly are posted on their registry. So there's quite an extensive background to the professionalism of the program. So rating scorecard and certification levels, what actually happens when you get rated is that you get a scorecard. Based on that scorecard, you can come in as being accessibility certified gold. This is a very small percentage of the number of ratings that we're doing. We're getting kind of 4% of building stock coming in as being accessibility certified gold. Accessibility certified lines up quite nicely with national code. This is also a fairly small percentage. We're ending up with about 40% of our ratings coming in there. And then below 60% on the rating is not certified. So the majority of buildings, or the building stock in Canada right now, is coming in as not certified. The Accessibility Professional Network, Brad mentioned this a little bit, so we're working on a professional network. This is going to be all the RHFAC professionals. We want to have 200 by 2020. There's some in this room. We have a course at Nova Scotia Community College that has support from the Accessibility Directorate. That's been proceeding really well. And we've got our first annual conference this fall in Toronto. Yeah, there we go. It's going to be over at Mars, which is an interesting site in Toronto and has done a fair bit in reference to accessibility and inclusion. And the conference is going to be able to provide that platform for professionals to discuss accessibility in Canada. There's the Accessibility Assessor training courses. As I mentioned, we have one in Nova Scotia at Nova Scotia Community College. We also have them across the country. So we have courses at Carleton University, at George Brown College, at SAIT, Southern Alberta Institute of Technology, and out in Vancouver at Vancouver Community College. We've also partnered with Athabasca, so I'm expecting an online course by early next year, which will be great, especially for working professionals to be able to take the course from home. RHFAC professionals, like I said, some of these are here in Halifax and here in the room. We've got 45 designated RHFAC professionals across the country and more than 200 who have completed the Accessibility Assessor training. If you complete the training, the good news is that you can use that for your professional development. It doesn't mean necessarily that you have to become a professional to conduct ratings. It's just a really good way to make sure that when you're making decisions about the built environment that you're paying attention to accessibility. Current stats. So we've done 1,200 sites across the country, some of which are here. And Gerry's going to note which ones are here. And so 1,200 sites to date, 718 are coming in as certified and 41 gold certified. A lot of that's been done with government support. We do have government support, of course, here. We have government support in British Columbia and most recently in Ontario. Last up, I'm just going to mention our Everyone Everywhere campaign. We just launched this last week. It's a campaign that we are launching nationally and that you're hopefully going to see a lot about on your media here in Halifax. And it's really that concept of being able to support our built environment, to support everybody to use them. So I'll go with one quick last video and then I'll hand it back to Gerry.
It's pretty simple, actually. Whether on a street, or a boulevard, or a secret path, a trail, or some sorry excuse for a dirt road. If you're on a train, tram, ship, boat, plane, a ferry, or a merry-go-round. If you're at an office, a school, or a playground, If you're at the beach, the bar, a party, or gallery, at a one-star restaurant, or a two-star motel, upstairs, downstairs, basement, or bathroom, if you're blind, if you're deaf, if you're tall, small, or tiny, if you've got 2 legs, 1 leg, no legs, or you're all legs. Whether you're a senior, have quadriplegia, or you're a Paralympian, if you've got a cane or crutches, walker, or wheelchair. It's time to build a world where everyone can go everywhere.
Great. And we'll hand it off to Gerry, maybe. Or we'll watch it again. There we go. Okay. To talk about how it's happening here in Halifax.
Well, thank you, Sarah. And in many ways, for a small province, we're leading the way in people being involved in this program. We have over 60 people who've been trained. You got 15 people who are certified, including DJ or TJ. And various organizations are using this new standard to do audits of their buildings. And well, there's very generous support available from the province. Some very significant things, for example, and I have to thank the mayor and city council, the entire Cogswell redevelopment district has been designated as a Rick Hansen Gold Zone. So anything going in there has to be designed to that highest standard. And in fact, now in Nova Scotia, we have our first gold certified facility, which is the airport. So congratulations for that, and there'll be a more formal announcement later on. But it's wonderful to see that whole access by design taking place. On the mobility side, I think there's a lot of work that we can do on that by integrating things more. And I have to compliment here Car Share Atlantic and Pam Cooley in particular for leading the way, not just in Nova Scotia, but in Canada. We have the first fully accessible car share service in Canada here. So thank you, Pam, for that. And again, that was a partnership with this not-for-profit, or that's for-profit social enterprise. The library here, in fact, they're nested in the library downstairs, and the province in making all of that happen. And another important thing about accessibility, it's not just about the built environment, it's also maintaining it, and all the difficulties that we've had over the years on snow clearance and the challenges that faces. Local level, we've been partnering with the Federation of Municipalities in Nova Scotia and been very successful. Wolfville was selected as the first demonstration to put together an accessibility plan. One of the reasons we selected Wolfville, interestingly enough, at least from my perspective, is when I looked around the province, it's a very vibrant, small community that's manageable. And as well, perhaps most importantly, is that most of their town council are women. And when you go to any gathering dealing with persons with disability, I'd say 80% of the participants are women, unfortunately. So I have to thank, and Mercedes Bain is here, one of the city councilors, town councilors. Thank you, Mercedes, for making that happen. And what they've done is some really innovative stuff to encourage this thing to happen, is that all new municipal buildings will hopefully be Rick Hansen Gold. It's a policy. They're considering bonus zoning to private developers. So if you go to Gold, you'll get additional density. Also fast-track developments. So if you're a Rick Hansen Gold Zone, you're going to jump to queue on getting the approvals. And as well, deduct the certification costs from any permitting fees that are there. So very innovative ways of making it happen. And I'll leave you with this quote here, like diversity is a fact, but inclusion is an act. And this is where the Accessibility Act, where the Halifax and the Wolfvilles, and you as community participants can play a major role in helping our community participate in all the things that are out there. And I thank you very much for that.